Hello and a very warm welcome to everybody participating in today's webinar. Today's event is the third in a series of ESOA workshops themed Global Challenges, Satellite Answers. And I'm thrilled to be joined by our panelists today. Gerry Collins, Director, Network Product Management at Intelsat, Maritza Delgado, Program Coordinator for Environment and Emergency Telecoms at the ITU BDT, and Isabelle Mauro, Director of Telecommunications and Digital Communications Industry at the World Economic Forum. Today, we're going to be talking about scaling up resilient networks. That's a need that the experience of the last few months has left us with no doubt about. The pandemic threat has also shown us that no one is immune to emergency situations. Every country needs to be prepared and ensure resilient connectivity is available to its citizens at all times. We're going to take a closer look at Intelsat's experience in Japan, where 3,000 3G and 4G sites across the islands rely solely on satellite backhaul. And we're going to see what lessons can we learn from this and how can they be applied in other regions. We're going to get right into the discussion. I will invite you to share your questions on the chat. Please be sure to write them to all panelists and attendees. We will do our best to get to them, time permitting. We are also going to be recording this session and we'll be making it available on our YouTube channel very soon. So Gerry, I'm going to start with you. Can you tell us something about what Intelsat saw in the use of its networks during COVID-19?
Yeah, so we saw quite a change in behavior from our users, from our customers, and from their end users. We saw things such as a rebalancing of networks, as in the trend over the last number of years has been for the downlink in networks, so people to be downloading content towards their devices, and that has led a lot of operators to see ratios of 6, 7, 8, 9, even 10 to 1 in terms of the traffic coming to the end user device. We've seen that reverse, and now the actual ratio is becoming smaller because a greater number of interactive applications are being used. So people using voice calls, using video calls on sessions such as this, where they've got two-way streams of media. So there's been a rebalancing of traffic on the network. As we look on a more geographic basis, you start to see the major demographic and in some ways the unfortunate humanitarian impact of COVID. On a demographic way, on a different demographic analysis, as I say, you mentioned our experience in Japan. We've seen a significant shift of traffic into the rural areas. Often when the mobile operators would look at where is the traffic moving in their networks, they might have seen a 20 or 25% increase in their overall traffic. That's because in some areas, such as the business districts, traffic has gone down, and that has been compensated by traffic in maybe the suburban areas as people work from home, etc. What we have seen, and I guess because we provide communications in areas that are maybe lower population density, and maybe where the infrastructure is maybe maybe weaker general infrastructure, we've seen a significant increase. People do not have an alternative to using cellular service for their work, for their education, for their health needs. So at certain times we were seeing a 100% increase in the amount of traffic on the network when we look purely at those areas. So the demographics have impacted the network as well. We think we've been able to support that, but this has been, it's almost an unprecedented shift and certainly unplanned for a shift. So the idea of resiliency and to be able to have a flexible network that can move capacity around, particularly move capacity in software, which is really, really key in this type of environment. Because as we know, the ability to actually put new hardware into the ground and get up new networks during the COVID period has been very, very challenging. So, and then of course, we've seen on a lot of the humanitarian work we do, significant increases, the work we do with the UN. We've seen 20 or 30% increase in traffic. So people availing of UN services in environments where they could have been in a particularly challenging either health or economic situation. again, the key for us has been the ability to expand those services in software, which is, you know, the direction of travel for I guess the telecommunications industry in general. The challenge has been to actually, in the cases where you need to put down new network hardware, it has been very, very challenging. But again, this move to kind of software enabled networks and moving capacity around in software has helped us meet the needs.
Great, thank you. And I mean, you mentioned humanitarian. Of course, also during the lockdown period, Vanuatu faced an earthquake. Maritza, let me come to you. We know that the ITU is frequently involved supporting the frontline response to disasters, and you personally have traveled to so many disaster zones at times of need. What has been your experience with satellite, and what, in your view, can governments do to be better prepared for emergency situations, be it an earthquake or be it a pandemic?
So thanks, Aarti, first of all, for inviting ITU to this very good discussion. As you mentioned, ITU, well, not being a humanitarian entity, but we support our member states in the aftermath of disasters by providing satellite telecommunications equipment, which is, of course, used to restore communication links affected by these natural hazards or disasters. As you mentioned, we have been involved in many different disaster situations, just to mention, and I have personally been traveling around the world, and as part of my work on emergency telecommunications, providing satellite equipment in the aftermath of disasters. Just to mention, just recent ones, the Caribbean islands that were affected by these huge hurricanes, Maria and Irma. And satellite communications are vital. But why do we use satellite equipment in the aftermath of disasters? Because it's an infrastructure that is ready to be used. And in times of crisis, this is what we need. We need urgent telecommunications. Satellite infrastructure is resilient and is not vulnerable to get affected or damaged by any natural hazard or in any adverse conditions on the ground. And of course, it has global coverage. And most important is that with recent technologies, satellite infrastructure can be deployed everywhere and be easily installed under rough conditions. And this is what we need when we work in emergency and disaster situations. So how can governments be more prepared to face emergency situations? We all know that the speed and efficiency of a response is proportional to the level of preparedness. So we need to be prepared in advance. And one of the key things that we need to consider is that some of the regions are more vulnerable to get affected by any hazard, like, for example, let's say the Pacific Islands or the Caribbean Islands. So we need to take that into consideration and to pre-position equipment in places where we can use them and we can fast deploy them to the affected regions. Like, for instance, in Vanuatu, we faced a very difficult situation due to two emergencies: the devastation caused by Hurricane Harold and the COVID lockdown. So fortunately, we had worked with government authorities and private sector way in advance. And we know the vulnerability, and we had pre-positioned satellite equipment. And something that, but you know, nothing is enough. Something that we were not prepared to is to provide connectivity. But fortunately, the satellite capacity and connectivity was provided by the satellite Pacific provider, the satellite provider. You know, preparedness is an effort that needs to involve different actors. It's not only about one entity, not one private sector. It's about coming all together, different stakeholders at a national level, private sector, government, UN entities working together to be more prepared and to provide a good response when disasters strike.
Thank you, Maritza. And you're right, the preparedness aspect, that's why the satellite industry signed a charter with the UN's Emergency Telecoms Cluster, and the ITU also signed on last year, a great step. Isabelle, let me come to you. I'm going to quote Albert Einstein. He said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. Now, the digital divide is nothing new. There have been so many initiatives taken and targets set to bridge it. The World Economic Forum recently launched the Edison Initiative, Essential Digital Infrastructure and Services Network. What makes this initiative different, and what does the forum hope to achieve with it? You're on mute, Isabelle.
Very, very good quote. Thank you, Aarti. I totally agree with you, and I think what has changed, if we look at the last 4 months, it's the lessons we've learned since February or March of this year. About 70% of countries around the world were in some sort of level of lockdown. The internet usage has increased by 70%. The tool we are using now and the similar tools, of video, virtual collaboration, have had a surge of 600%. So whatever we do now, the world has changed. So basically, if you look at what connectivity has ensured that people have been connected around the world, have been able to work remotely, study remotely, and be diagnosed or cured remotely, what we also experienced, all of us, is that we've been exposed, or the world has been exposed even more to the digital gap that was already existing. And I think the novelty here is that we used to talk about digital divide in Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. We are talking of digital divide in the heart of the US. I'm sitting in New York, in Manhattan. I had problems connecting, to my network. The rural, Gerry was mentioning of the shift to rural areas. That is the difference that has been happening in Europe, in the US, in the heart of the most developed countries, if you want. So very quickly, we developed with the ITU and Maritza's team, Doreen, and the World Bank and the GSMA an action plan that was targeted at governments and industries to help them, ensuring that there was some continuity, affordability, and reliability of connectivity and services around the world. But that was short-term, immediate measures. So we soon realized, and that's where I come to the Edison, that what we needed, this was really a watershed moment, right? Where governments realized that if they didn't have enough connectivity, the whole society, the whole nation could not function as normal. And this was really, I think, the big change in the minds of people that had to use digital services, and governments, response to the crisis that was emerging. So we created the Edison initiative in order to make sure that really we could bring all the stakeholders around the table, from public and private sector, but differently to any other initiative that is existing, also bringing to the table the other sector that are so critical. Because when you talk about digital inclusion these days, it's no longer about just having satellite, having terrestrial, non-terrestrial, wireless, fixed. It's not about the networks anymore. It's about health inclusivity, it's about health inclusion, education inclusion, financial services, financial inclusion. And so the network that we created, the Edison, really come together to create frameworks and partnership, leveraging partnerships that are already existing and seeing how we can scale them up. And we've just started doing this with the digital villages, for instance, of American Tower, with the UN food program. So it's really leveraging that platform to bring and scaling up what is already existing. And exchanging, of course, best practices and issuing recommendations, trying to work with recommendations to see at what has worked in some countries and what can we replicate in others, to make the digital inclusion, or to bridge the digital gap, if you want. And first outcome that we have out of the group, and Aarti, you are part of the group, so thank you as well for your contributions there, is a playbook on accelerating the digital inclusion in the new normal. So we're really looking at a set of simple strategies and measures that need to be implemented in the medium to longer term to make sure that we close this digital gap as soon as possible. And one is looking at defining national strategies horizontally around, again, education, ICT. So it's having ministers of transport, of education, of health, working with the ICT ministry and doing these national holistic strategies. The second one, which is, I think, the novelty here, is really earmarking some of the money that is coming from the rescuing package, you know, the stimulus packages, and we just saw the EU that had agreed yesterday, earmark some of this recovery package to fund infrastructure investment in underserved areas, but also to the digitalization of other sectors such as education, healthcare, etc., and facilitation of the SMEs, digitalization of SMEs, which represent up to 90% in most of the countries. And as we know, they've been the most badly hit, you know, by the crisis. And finally, but I'll come to that later in more detail, it's to ensure that really we increase the optimization of mixed technologies across fixed. And, you know, it's no longer, and I'm totally with you, Gerry and Aarti, we need to capitalize on the mix of existing and emerging technologies that are already there. So collaboration and a new form of collaboration is the new way of working, and the novelty, if you want, of Edison across sectors. And I would say it's the urgency, right? It's this watershed moment that everybody now knows. We do not have 10 years. And we don't have 5 years, because there might be another crisis around the corner, and this crisis is here to stay for a few more months and possibly even a year.
Thanks, Isabelle. I totally applaud what you say. Indeed, from the satellite perspective, we have for too long felt a little bit like a lone voice championing the digital divide. And finally, actually with this pandemic, which has been so tragic for so many people, it is unifying us also across industry sectors, which is a great thing. Gerry, let me come back to you. Japan had a very clear reason to start thinking about reliability in its networks post their 2011 earthquake, the tsunami, and then the overheating of the Fukushima nuclear power station. But COVID and recent disasters have shown that all countries need to do this, not just high-risk ones, or not just those who have experienced a disaster. So we know satellite is an essential component of resilient networks, but what needs to happen to drive take up of satellite backhaul and scale more generally, like we saw in Japan?
Well, first of all, to say, I think we all owe a certain amount of gratitude to Maritza and her team, because the work that her team does, and particularly during COVID, in the case of a real humanitarian disaster, I think she deserves recognition. The unsung heroes, I would say. And also to Isabelle, what we saw in Japan was a disaster, a humanitarian, a demographic, an economic disaster for Japan. The Japanese mobile operators, the government, they learned from that. They put in new practices. And to hear that, you know, rapidly someone at the World Economic Forum is saying, what can we learn? What needs to be the next steps is really, really encouraging, because that rapid learning and implementation of new ideas is what we need. So what can the world learn from what Japan did, and also there's other countries who've had maybe smaller scale emergencies, and how they've had to react to introduce more reliable, dependable communication. So Japan started to say, well, actually, first of all, we need greater emergency communications. When people get into trouble, they need to be able to communicate. So that drives, from a political, a regulatory, a government perspective, is that we need communications everywhere. So it drives a strategy of how do I get to a situation where literally 100% of my land mass is covered, not just my population, but actually my land mass is covered. So that has been a major initiative in Japan. But beyond that, it is saying, well, look, we're going to possibly have earthquakes, tsunamis again. How can we have a doubly reliant network, that if the terrestrial connections go down, all of a sudden I can, for example, bring in satellite. So it's one of these hybrid solutions that Isabelle has talked about. It's not about one technology. It's about actually combining the best. So what they've done is they've obviously then introduced a significant portion of their network, particularly in the rural, harder to reach areas, of satellite, using satellite to get that coverage, but also introducing satellite as a dependability, as a backup. You know, when the terrestrial goes down, how can I very, very quickly switch into satellite. So, and I would say actually, you've already seen in a number of other countries that learning. You know, you could say in the UK, where I live, there's been significant problems around flooding. And of course, when the floods happen, a lot of the terrestrial connectivity immediately disappears. So how do you provide connectivity? And satellite can play its role, but also other you know, evolving technologies can play a role. We're starting to see high altitude platforms starting to kind of play roles in those situations. So there already is that learning going on in countries. What has to happen for these things to happen and become more widespread? Yes, there'll always be a political and regulatory driver, but we also need to look at the economic model of how these solutions take place. And it's something in Intelsat we look at very, very deep. Well, what is the economic model for connecting people in low density areas, difficult to reach? And there's things that we have learned. You know, don't do the same solutions that you do in the high density areas. You know, start with a clean sheet of paper. You know, look at what the incentives are for people to invest in those areas. What kind of returns can there be? What is the scale of the infrastructure that works? That you know that balances the scale of the initial investment against the payback, because we cannot expect everything to happen purely based on the political and the regulatory. We must look at economic models, different business models, which incentivize other people to come in. It's not necessarily always the mobile network operators that are going to say, I'm going to put my money into those rural areas. There's plenty of models around the world where third parties have come in, built out those networks, and then shared revenues with the mobile operators. So political regulatory important, but also economic models.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, and you mentioned lessons learned. Now, Maritza, coming back to you, we know satellite is great for an emergency, but emergency is the new normal. And wherever there's an emergency, so many countries, we always see them starting from scratch. Now, how can that be? There have been so many disasters around the world. There are guidelines in place, including from the ITU. It shouldn't be that countries actually have to start from scratch. There has to be preparedness, as you mentioned earlier. Now, you as the ITU has issued national emergency telecoms preparedness guidelines, pandemic guidelines. These things are only useful if member states actually implement them. I know you have a lot of field experience, Maritza, but in your view, how can we work with the ITU to drive a greater understanding, appreciation, and implementation of these guidelines?
Well, this is a very good point. And although we have developed the ITU guidelines, which are a very good tool to assist all the national policy makers and national regulatory authorities to develop the national emergency telecommunication plans that you have mentioned, these plans need to be implemented. We can develop the best plans and we can have the best business continuity plans, but if we don't implement them, then we are not doing anything. But a good thing that these plans can provide, and this is why it is required to implement them, is that they provide the capacities and capabilities for emergency responses. And it establishes a governance framework of roles and responsibilities of each one of the entities participating in the development and also in the implementation. And here is where the satellite sector can work very closely with government, because connectivity, as we heard before, does not come alone. The national emergency telecommunication plans include regulatory and legal frameworks and spectrum and frequency allocation and everything that is needed to implement these national strategies at a national level. With the support of these legal frameworks and regulatory, we support the implementation of these national strategies. But however, we cannot only wait until the implementation phase. We need to work and we need to get involved in the development phase. And how we do this? We are now working with different stakeholders in providing support for them to develop these national emergency telecommunication plans, which are based on our guidelines. And we hold national consultation meetings, inviting all entities at a national level, including government, private sector, ICT private sector, customs authorities, which are key when a disaster happens to release equipment in a timely manner. They need to be involved. And these national consultation meetings provide the opportunity to assess the needs of each one of the entities participating. And this is where I see the opportunity for all of us to get involved in this development. And these plans, as you mentioned, should be a living document. We cannot develop one national strategy and have it there sitting forever. These plans need to be updated regularly and depending on the needs of each one of the countries. And for these, to support the implementation and to have these plans as a living document, we have developed also emergency telecommunications tabletop simulation guide, everything in ITU's guidelines. But these guidelines are really good because they provide a step-by-step process on how to develop a desk-based tabletop simulation. And this involves all national authorities and entities to refine national plans, including policies and regulatory frameworks. And this exercise also gives an overview of whether networks, redundant communications capacity, personnel, and other communication systems are in place and ready to be used for a disaster response. I heard from Gerry that is what Japan is doing in the moment, assessing which are the needs to include and to have network redundancy in places where you had connectivity, but you need redundant systems. So people can be able to have that connectivity. And during this lockdown, we have seen that increment on the use of this infrastructure, which was not done before. I also heard from Isabelle that it is very important that this work should be done through a holistic approach, multi-stakeholder approach, not only one entity working alone, but involving all entities at a national level. Ministries working with health sector, ICT ministries working with health sector, with transport, with energy sector, which is vital when we are talking about networks and continuity of service. So this is something that we really need to take into consideration when we are going to implement these national strategies at a national level. Thank you.
Thanks, Maritza. Maritza, before I go back to Isabelle, let me just ask you, I mean, when you go in the field, you're taking satellite equipment with you. We've had one of the questions around electricity mapping and this kind of thing. I know you've had some interesting experiences with that. Can you just shed some light on that for a second?
Of course, when you deploy equipment on the ground, you have to take with you everything. And something that I just really want to mention is, like, for example, electricity, as you just said, which is key. Without electricity, we cannot power on with our equipment. So at the end, we are not doing anything. So what ITU has in mind and also deploys is that with every satellite phone or every satellite beacon or any VSAT system, we deploy also solar power energy. So people can be able to use these devices. Otherwise, it is not possible. And something that I just want to conclude and mention is that we have also developed the contingency plan for pandemics. And this plan for pandemics includes the power sector, the energy sector, to have ready backup power. So in case of any emergency on top of the pandemic, we have the possibility to continue using this infrastructure at home. You know, we are not talking about outside, at home, because you need to have something there ready to power your equipment. Otherwise, you will not be able to use them. And also this pandemic contingency plan outlines a set of actions that countries could implement and anticipate to be ready to ensure the network continuity service delivery for future pandemics. So here I think we need to work all together so we can deliver the communications to everyone in times of disasters and in times of pandemics.
Thanks, Maritza. I know security is also a very, very relevant issue there. And I recall you telling me how the solar generators that were used for the satellite equipment were just being stolen all the time. But okay, that's a separate issue. Let's not get into that. Isabelle, let me come back to you. I've been involved, I've been fortunate enough to be involved in the Forum's Council on Space Technology already since 2012, but it's only very recently that the satellite sector has had the opportunity to contribute to the Forum's digital work. What can the Forum do to break down the silos and foster greater collaboration across sectors and include more satellite in its initiatives to ultimately achieve more connectivity, like we've seen with the Intelsat SoftBank collaboration in Japan, and like we see with so many satellite operators and mobile operators around the world?
So Aarti, in the digital space, just maybe to correct, on the digital space, the satellite industry has been involved since 2015 with us, with the Forum. We launched an initiative which was called Internet for All back in 2015, and we had ESOA that was part, a full partner of that initiative. So there is a history, at least in the last 5 years, of the satellite being involved. We also, Internet for All took the sort of framework that we had, the global framework, and implemented it in countries. So we did projects in countries with governments and partners, and we did have in South Africa a project where in fact Intelsat was one of our partners there, and in Argentina we had ARSAT. So it's not, the Edison initiative, if you want, is not the first time we are involved. And we hope, with Edison, we really hope that with you and approaching others, in the satellite space, that we could bring to the table as well. Satellite gets a greater voice as well. But I think automatically, I do believe things have changed, even in the mindset of operators. And I just want to go back to something that you all mentioned, that is collaboration. And this is key, and this is where we really have a role to play, where partners, the different stakeholders, be it again in wireless, fixed, satellite, terrestrial, non-terrestrial, balloons, everybody needs to consider each other a collaborator and not a competitor, because we all have a common gain, a common aim, and gain business-wise as well. It is a social gain and an economic gain for governments, for society, to be able to have everybody connected to the internet, but effectively it should also be an economic gain for companies. And I think the one thing maybe that is changing, and don't quote me on this because it's something I've started thinking, and you mentioned it, Gerry, again this morning, society, the demographic is shifting from the towns to rural, and that is brought in mainly by the working from home. So if you think of Manhattan, and again I'm taking this example because I'm here at the heart of it, one of the main worries of Manhattan today is how we're going to tax, the tax revenues is going to go down, because there is a percentage of people, which I think is 20 or 30% of people have left Manhattan. And chances are, the predictions are, that half of those are not going to come back to Manhattan. So we see really a shift, and a lot of this shift is shifting towards rural. I come from the south of France, and my parents are telling me that the villages around them, so many people have been renting houses there, and they're probably there to stay. So when my parents didn't have, proper Wi-Fi 5-6 years ago, still in the village where they are, now it becomes a necessity. It's crucial because so many people are going to be living there. So I think we are going to see a natural shift. And I hope that, the satellite solutions like you are mentioning, Gerry and Aarti and all, that is going to be part of this shift that we are seeing, because where mobile, where wireless or fixed doesn't make proper sense in economic terms, we all have to work together to look at solutions and think of, you know, when I mean collaboration, I smile because when I started the GSMA in 2000, you know, one of the big worries at the time for the wireless industry was Wi-Fi. Oh my God, Wi-Fi is coming to the market and Wi-Fi is going to destroy, because we are giving, you know, Wi-Fi is free basically. So they quickly had to figure out a business model where they were going to be part of the equation, and they are. So I'm really confident, and maybe I'm over optimistic, but I'm really confident that this is the moment where the demand is there for this collaboration and for looking at really these mixed and hybrid solutions that we can all make work together. And satellite, I'm convinced, will be, you know, is already part of it. You've already seen what has happened in Japan. And you know, we'll need to duplicate and replicate and scale examples like that, where it makes economic sense for all of these entities to work together.
Yeah, yeah, brilliant. Look, Gerry, in Japan, we saw that you backhauled 3G and 4G sites, and 3,000 of them, not negligible. But in Africa, Intelsat and other operators are actually still rolling out 2G and 3G backhaul. Is it right to help people connect to 2G and 3G? Shouldn't we be aiming at connecting them to at least 4G, especially where you have a green field and you can invest from scratch? I mean, if you're going to anyway make the investment in 2G and 3G, why not just directly do it in 4G?
Okay, if I can just make one comment before answering the question. What Isabelle said is really, really important. We are no longer competing technology verticals. We are an integrated industry. We are integrated as part of the telecommunications industry. And the key sign of that is that there is a non-terrestrial networking component of the 5G standards in Release 17. And that was voted by the mobile operators majority in 2007, at the end of 2019. That for me was the greatest single sign to say, as evidence of the words that Isabelle has just used, which is that we are part of the solution. We're not the solution. Nobody is the solution. But by integrating, we become part of the solution. And that is actually happening. That's happening through standards, which is a great way to do it. So coming back to, yes, it's true. when there's so much talk about 5G, there are cases today where we are providing connectivity to villages in Africa where it's 2G. That is, we've got to also remember that for a number of people, if your village has never been connected and it has no electricity and it has never been connected in any way, the step from no communications to 2G is actually probably the biggest change in your life that you can have. Yes, of course, 3G, 4G and everything will make a difference, but the ability to be able to just simply communicate with people over a distance is actually the biggest change, those villages. It's some of the villages that we connect through partners. You see the videos of the people, they literally have a party the day that the tower arrives in the village. And this is a lot about business model. And in some ways, it is about sustainability. Too many times, for very, very good reasons, people will have made investments and not looked enough at what is sustainable long-term. That drives people to look at, well, where can I start? What is the starting point? And for a number of people, particularly in Africa, the starting point is, what handset do people have? And one thing is for sure, in the African village, there are thousands of 2G handsets. You might have maybe 50% of those handsets are also able to do 3G. You might maybe also have maybe 20% of them are doing 4G. So it does mean that as people look at how can I be sustainable, they start with 2G. But they do have plans to upgrade pretty rapidly to 3G, 4G as they see the traffic coming up. So it is based on ensuring that we have a sustainable economic model to make sure that if somebody makes the investment in that tower, in that village, that they have an incentive to keep coming and keep investing and adding that capability. Yes, 2G is not really where you want to start, but it is the start which allows you to get on the journey to evolve those people. And in many cases, it's not just 2G. You start in day one with 2G, 3G. We work through a number of partners. Sometimes we work directly with the mobile operators, sometimes we work through partners. we worked through two very, very interesting companies. One is Africa Mobile Networks, is a UK company that has invested in building towers all over rural Africa in a form of revenue share with the mobile operator. They bring capital, they build the tower, and then they share the revenue with the particular mobile operator whose frequencies they use. They have now almost 2,000 towers in Africa. We work with Intelsat in Peru, who have an agreement with Telefonica. Telefonica have said, well, we're not going to deploy in those rural areas, but Intelsat, you can benefit from a new licensing regime, and you can deploy a network, you can invest in that network, and we will give you a significant share of the revenue that you generate from our customers that are connecting to it. Both of these models, we believe, are very, very economically viable and sustainable. So to come back to your question, 2G is often the starting point, but and it is the starting point to get people to 3G and 4G. But to ensure sustainability, it's often still the starting point.
Isabelle, can I bring you in on the same question? I know when I've participated in some of your groups, you have some strong voices there who have in previous occasions, at previous ITU meetings especially, said that it makes no sense to invest in something less than 4G in today's world, and no mobile operator will do that. Now, Gerry has just made the point that it's about economics, it's about the business model that works. As playing your role as the forum, you're going to publish a playbook shortly. In your playbook, you are reasonably prescriptive about the types of speeds and latencies that you believe, or that the community that you have involved believes should be deployed in key areas. Now, isn't that going along with the notion that indeed we should only be aiming for 4G? What's your view on this?
Well, I think there are, Gerry mentioned many times business model and economic sense. And I think we have also to understand what is the economics behind what has been invested in the networks, of the mobile operators. I do believe that in many countries, through 2G and 3G in particular, they are already able to deliver part of the services that we want to deliver. Now, there has been a substantial effort, and unless I'm wrong, from operators in many countries where they're really looking to leapfrog directly from 2G to 4G, completely skipping 3G. I mean, you saw in Myanmar, for instance, where they went directly, at the time to 4G, and that was, a sort of a prime test that we had in that area. So I think every operator is going to look at the business model, at what makes sense. And I think that's where probably we'll have to look at hybrid solutions, as we are trying, Aarti, you are part of this discussion in the Edison group, is where it doesn't make sense to develop, go to 4G directly. What are the hybrid solutions that we can come together and look at? And I think that's a discussion we'll need to have even more as we look into 5G, because 5G could further that divide even more. And so, we really need, I think now is a sort of a crucial point where we can't miss the U-turn, because, with this increase of digital, the digital hybrid world that we are moving to, this is becoming crucial that again, we work all together. So I cannot talk to the operators, I am no longer the GSMA. I can't tell you what makes sense. I think every operator is going to look at what makes sense economically. But what I am confident again, and I repeat this, is these things have changed. The world has changed in the last 3-4 months. And there is really the urgency, the pressure that even operator maybe didn't have before, that really maybe now there will be some more economic incentives to roll out in areas that before didn't make economic sense for them. And I'm really confident of that, and that we will see that shift, and that they will be more open to collaborate, maybe, with others, to see what economically is going to work out to reach most of the population. And I think the shift as well, the big shift here, remember is that, you know, we had about 300 million people working from home, right? We had about 300 million kids, and now we have 1 billion children or students out of school around the world. They are not going to go back offline, you know, not all of them. So this again is a shift. There is a whole new market, you know, and it's a sad reality, because, you know, it's sad that we are building on some crisis and unprecedented, you know, disaster for humanity, but we are learning very quick. And I think this shift in education, in healthcare, telemedicine, you know, we've seen 3,000-fold increase in telemedicine outreach in the US, you know, and around the world. This is changing the way we communicate, the way we do business, medicine, etc., forever. So I am confident, Aarti, again, that this is shifting the way even mobile operators are going to be responding to this new reality we are facing.
Yeah, I'm actually curious to see what changes in mindset we do see. I mean, the one that we as a satellite sector is always pushing for is more collaboration and so on. It almost sounds like a cliche, but whether from a business perspective, we will now see a shift from the mobile operators, and that will drive greater collaboration, is something that we should really watch closely. We are getting quite a few questions on the chat. One of them is about spectrum, and specifically spectrum for emergency communications. Maritza, I know you're from ITUD, you're not necessarily R, but do you have a view on that? And Gerry also, spectrum availability for emergency communications in the new normal. Come off mute.
Yes, yeah. So yes, this is, we work very closely with the radio communication sector to ensure that they really have, and they really encourage countries to have these regulatory, this spectrum available for emergency telecommunications. BR just had the WRC 19, where we had new recommendations on spectrum availability for PPDR, so for public protection and emergency and disaster risk reduction. So yes, and we encourage countries to work along not only with the regulatory authorities at national level, but with all the entities involved in disaster management, because it is key. As I mentioned before, through these national consultation meetings, we assess the needs of the countries, and it is very good to include all the mobile providers, the satellite industry there, because then countries will take those into consideration to see what are the requirements of each one, of the mobile sector, of the satellite sector, to include them in their specific framework for disaster management. The regulations, the legal, spectrum, frequencies, everything, and it has to be, you know, be prepared in advance. And yes, we work together with the radio communication sector to ensure that this specific spectrum for emergency purposes is always incorporated there at the national level.
Thanks. Gerry, you want to come in?
No, I won't. Look, I focus a lot really on kind of the infrastructure and how we get the solutions in place. I'm not the spectrum expert. I see a couple of other questions that were addressed to me. Is it okay if I go ahead and yeah, something maybe I have more expertise on? A gentleman, Zamba, in South Sudan, asking about your grandfather in the 4G. You know, actually 4G solutions come with 3G and 2G as well. And yes, of course. And I think what's interesting is there's developments in the cellular world, you know, software-defined radios, where essentially you've got 2G, 3G, 4G being integrated and maybe using the same frequency band, which we're kind of hopeful will reduce the total cost of ownership for getting those initial systems out in place. So I absolutely agree with the sentiment behind that question. And you know, some of the developments like Open RAN, etc., I think are helping us along this way. So that is definitely a way to go. I saw also a question about an enterprise, a satellite enterprise having its own mobile core. I wouldn't be quite so positive on that, because I think, as we said with Isabelle, it's really about satellite technologies and other technologies integrating as part of a solution. And when I talked about AMN and Intelsat, for example, they integrate into the mobile operator's core network, so they become part of the system. It allows them to leverage the brands, the billing system, et cetera, So I'm not really so much into the idea of a satellite enterprise coming and being a whole vertical solution. We're part of the solution.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Gerry. There's a question for Maritza. How will you know when the appropriate quality of service expectations have been met across the disaster affected areas, and what metrics are used to assess this?
Well, this is a part of the activities in the response and recovery phase. And one of those activities is to assess what are the damages and what are the needs. And we build in lessons learned. So when we see that there are services that need to be in place, or the expectations have been met, then through the assessment that we develop after the emergency response, then that gives us the answer on what needs to be enhanced, so it can be there in the national plan, so it can be better done in future emergencies. So this is how we do. We cannot develop this in advance. We have to learn from what has happened, assess the damages, and then build back better.
Thank you, Maritza. So we have another question about whether COVID has changed what should be considered as an acceptable broadband service in rural areas. Now, you can come at this from multiple perspectives. Those of us who are fortunate enough to be in cities and have great broadband speeds, we see how we can do all of these Zoom calls and all this interactive dialogues that we're having during the lockdown and so on. Equally, that can lead us to believe that everybody needs at least this. However, there are so many case studies, there are so many examples, rural communities, whether they're in the US, the UK, or in rural parts of Asia and Africa, where even with satellite or with WISPs, we see connectivity which has download speeds of maybe 2 megabit per second, maybe 10 to 15. I mean, with satellite, the typical one we hear about from the members is around 10, and it's certainly not symmetrical. And yet they're enabling so many of the applications that all of us have come to rely on today. Isabelle, what's your perspective on what is an acceptable broadband service in rural areas as a result of COVID? What's your view on that?
Well, again, I think because everybody is going to, so many people are going to move in rural, what is acceptable, the quality is going to rise a lot. We need, if you are an enterprise and you need your employees to work from wherever they are in a village or in remote Arkansas here, I don't know, you will have to improve the speed, because otherwise, the economy is not going to run. You will have to, the pandemic here, for instance, and I take the example of the US because I'm sitting here, and to me, I have been pesado, I don't know how you say that in English. I've been nearly shocked as to how this country was unprepared for this. And in terms, and I'm talking not just in terms of medicals, in terms of even connectivity, and so I think this is a wake-up call for everybody, that it's not that it was acceptable, it's that it was just unknown. I think nobody really realized, because everybody was migrating towards the cities, and we are seeing a reverse shift, and that is going to change that. But if you think of more, that's more for the rural, but if you think more of rural in countries that are least developed. I think we also need to think, and that ties back to the discussion we had about 4G. It's not just about rolling out 4G. It's about thinking, what can 4G do that 2G cannot do or 3G cannot do? And it's not just about the connectivity. You know, you could put handsets, and I think Orange, like many years ago, or not so many, maybe 5-6 years ago, gave free phones, you know, in Africa and did the test. People didn't know what to do with them. And so, you know, it's not just about the connectivity, it's about making the services affordable, because if you have the connectivity and people cannot afford a handset that has the 4G capability, well, you know, you've rolled out for nothing, because that is not going to work. So and literacy. People need to know how to use, you know, a 4G. So I think it's really a whole sets of things. It's about connectivity, but yes, connectivity is going to be the prime, but it's about, for instance, Maritza, you were mentioning about electricity, right? There are still 1 billion people in the world that are not connected to electricity. That already writes off anybody that could have connectivity. So it's really, again, coming back to these efforts of working all together to make all of this, bringing the quality to rural and underserved areas all together, and not just about, you know, 4G or 3G or 5G, but making sure that we all make the effort towards the same goal, which is connecting everybody.
Thank you, Isabelle. I mean, I think you make the point very well about different regions will require different solutions and have also different expectations. Gerry, we just have a couple of minutes left. Can I bring you in on this as well?
Yeah, no, for sure. The requirement, it's quite clear that the requirement in the rural areas is increasing. The point that Isabelle makes about you know, devices and how do people use them, it brings up the point that actually the biggest challenge almost in the communications world is not so much the people that live outside communications connectivity. It's a lot to do with the people who live under the umbrella of telecommunications connectivity, but don't use the service. And that's because of illiteracy, it's because of poverty, it's because of lack of power, and it's you know, it's also related to gender issues in certain markets. And these are actually the biggest impact, even without pushing connectivity further, is to actually get people to use the connectivity that exists today. And that is, let's not forget that the unconnected but covered is the biggest group in the world. So yes, we need improved connectivity. Look, satellite has a role to play in here, because satellite has this great advantage of sharing capacity, so that, you know, you're using the capacity 1 minute or 1 second in one particular village, and then when that village finishes with it, then it goes to the next village, and it's all very, very dynamically allocated. So you get this really, really good economic sharing capability. So yes, you can deliver quite high speeds, but as I say, you've got to look at what is the biggest incremental impact to people's lives. It can be 2G, but once you start 3G, 4G, I think what we've seen people really struggling with is, I've heard so many people say, I've only got a 2 megabit or a 3 megabit link. I think that the big deficit, the big change in terms of data connectivity, people start to get 10 megabit connectivity. The 2 and 3, you've heard so many people saying, I've got that, my service is just not working. So once you get to the 10 megabit is kind of where people can have a difference, or can make a difference to people.
Thanks, Gerry. And indeed, that's what in the UK the government has said, that for them an acceptable and a decent broadband speed is in fact 10 megabit per second as what people need. There's another question about when will the EU-wide offer of at least 100 megabit per second download service by satellite arrive. And I believe we have 2 operators who are going to be operational with those kind of offers in 2021, or for the start of 2021. The big question is, of course, will people actually use it? Will they demand it? Is that what they will be willing to pay for? Okay, so we are at 1 o'clock, we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for having participated. I mean, the discussion has been very interesting. We could easily carry on, but let me thank our panelists for taking the time to animate today's webinar. Thanks to all of the participants who have joined us. Please follow ESOA on Twitter and LinkedIn. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and our newsletter to be informed about future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.